My name is Aisha, and I am the kind of woman people underestimate until they hear my voice shaking and still steady at the same time, until they see what I will do for the people I love and for the pieces of myself I refuse to abandon. The day I met Imran, I didn't know that I was beginning a journey that would end with a dress I never wore, a wedding aisle I never walked, and a revenge so meticulous it could have been a wedding plan in reverse. But if you know anything about me, know this. I do not let anyone rewrite my life without learning to write in ink of my own. I grew up with my father, Abid, after my mother died when I was 8. He used to braid my hair before school and stick a little jasmine pin above my ear, saying it made me look like sunshine. He was not a perfect man, but he tried. When I was 15, he married a woman named Samina, whose smile never reached her eyes and whose words were soft as a cat padding toward a trapped bird. She moved into our little house with her perfumes that coated every doorway and her rules that sounded like kindness until you listened closely. She said girls should be neat, grateful, simple, quiet, and I learned that quiet was the easiest way to survive, the way to keep the peace, the way to let my father be happy with his second chance. I learned to count my steps so they wouldn't echo. Still, I wasn't a victim in my own house. I studied, I worked part-time, I saved small money in a jar behind the flour tin labeled rice. I wrapped my dreams in brown paper and placed them high in the cupboard. The first time Samina called me selfish for wanting university, I smiled and looked down and went anyway. The first time she pretended to be sick on a morning I had an exam, my father begged me to reschedule. I did not. Somehow, in a house that felt like it belonged to someone else, I found a way to belong to myself. On the day I met Imran, I was running late to a meeting with my professor about a research project. I spilled tea on my notes, slipped my phone into my bag, and collided with a man carrying a box of pastries out of a bakery. The lid popped open, and sugared puffs tumbled like playful stars. He looked at the mess and then at me and laughed. Not in that mean way people laugh when they want you to feel small, but like the problems of the day had just turned into something sweet and ridiculous. I apologized and offered to pay for the pastries. He said, "You look like you need one more than I do." He handed me a custard-topped one, even though I was the one who ruined it. I bit into it, cream freezing my tongue with joy. He told me he was delivering the box to his mother's house because Thursdays were sweet days at home. I told him I didn't have time for sweet days, that life was one long list of expectations for me to fulfill. He tilted his head and asked quietly, "And which ones are yours?" It was such a simple question that I couldn't answer. We talked for 10 minutes, and I was late for 20. And later that evening, when I checked the folded napkin he pressed into my hand with a pastry for the road, it had his number and the words, "For your sweet day, when you remember which one belongs to you." We began slowly, because I do not fall the way other people fall. I have learned to check the floor before I step. But Imran was patient in a way that made patience feel like a language, not a virtue. He would send me pictures of sunrises he took on his way to work and ask which one I liked better, and I would choose the pink one. And he would say, "Of course, because you always choose the brave colors." We would meet for tea between classes and work, and he would ask me about my research, and I would ask him about his dreams. He worked with a small importing business his uncle ran, more responsibility than recognition, but he was building. There was something honest about his hands, the way he folded receipts, the way he picked up cups, like he knew how to hold things without breaking them. The first time I brought his name to my father smiled with a worry that walked behind his eyes. He said, "If you are happy, I want to be happy for you." He invited Imran to the house that weekend. The night before, Samina pulled me aside while she stirred the dal. She said, "Men are only charming until they are not." She asked about his family, his status, whether they had the kind of reputation that would make our reception look respectable. She said a poor wedding means a poor marriage. I watched the steam lift from the pot and imagined it was her ego. I said, "My wedding will be rich in something else." She laughed and told my father I was dreamy and naive, and my father hushed her gently. Imran arrived with the same pastry box from months before, filled again and tied with a ribbon. He greeted my father with a handshake and a respectful bow of his head. He thanked Samina for opening her home and handed her a delicate jasmine-scented candle. She softened just a fraction. Everyone likes to be recognized. And I saw how he navigated people, not by pretending, but by finding a path through their brambles with small gifts of attention. After dinner, we sat in the living room. My father asked him about stability, about responsibilities, about how two people could build a life in a city where everything cost more than it should. Imran answered steadily, but he said something that made me feel like a bird remembering it had wings. He said, "If Aisha keeps her work and studies after we marry, I will be proud. I will support her sharpening the life she's already begun." My father nodded slowly, and I saw hope begin to roost in the corners of the room. But hope never lives unchallenged under Samina's roof. She asked about dowry and expectations, about which family would pay for which ceremony. She smiled when she said, "I'm an old-fashioned woman." Imran said, "On this I am very modern. We will do what is fair, and we will not do anything that humiliates or binds." For the first time that evening, Samina's smile slipped. The engagement came with gold bangles I would never have chosen for myself, and a ring so simple it felt like a promise grown from a seed, not a showcase. We planned the wedding for the fall. I chose a dress with light catching on its hem like memories. I chose songs that reminded me of windows open to the evening breeze. We built a guest list and a menu and a budget that did not break our bones. My father counted money in the evenings, and Samina counted faces, insisting we invite her whole extended network because it would be an embarrassment otherwise. When I pushed back, she sighed and told me that a good bride understands the difference between personal wishes and family duty. I knew her language by now. She meant her wishes and her pride. I found ways to cut costs in places that wouldn't sour the day. Smaller centerpieces, less expensive photography, favors made at home by my friends and me. Imran and I talked like warriors entering a peace treaty, mapping where the battles would be and where we could concede. He kissed the top of my head in the mosque courtyard one afternoon, a light, respectful touch, and told me he had never felt so sure about anything. I believed him. I believed us. 2 weeks before the wedding, I woke to find the house already awake. Samina stood in the hallway with a stack of papers clasped to her chest like a baby she didn't want to drop. My father sat on the edge of the sofa with his hands folded, a tight little prayer of fingers. When he looked up at me, I understood something had cracked. Samina cleared her throat and said, "There have been developments." She handed me a paper with a shaky red circle drawn around a line that made no sense at first. It looked like an expense list, but the numbers were wrong. She said, "Your fiancé's family is hiding debts." I blinked. "No," I said calmly. "Imran and I went over everything together. We've been honest." She held up another paper, a printout from a WhatsApp thread with blurry screenshots, and she began to narrate messages that implied Imran's uncle had defaulted on a shipment, and that Imran, in desperation, had used funds earmarked for the wedding to cover it. The story was ugly and convenient. I told her the printouts were meaningless, and I would ask Imran, and she said there was no need because she had already told the aunties, and the aunties had told their husbands, and now my father would be a laughingstock if we proceeded. My father stood up then and put a hand on my shoulder, and in the pressure of his fingers, I felt how much he hated conflict, and how much he loved me, and how those two forces were pulling him apart. He said, "Aisha, sometimes we have to think of the family," and I felt my throat burn. Think of the family? What family would I be building if I tore down the one man who had never asked me to be small? I called Imran. He picked up on the second ring, voice warm with the kind of sunrise we used to share. When I explained, he went quiet and then said softly, "Give me 30 minutes. He arrived at the house with his documents and his accountant on the phone. We sat at the kitchen table while Samina stood in the doorway like a gate. Imran explained that the screenshots were incomplete, that the debt was an uncle's and had been restructured months ago, that our wedding funds were untouched. He showed the accounts. My father listened, relief beginning to pull at the edges of his mouth. Samina was ready for this, though. She had a second stack of papers. She laid them down like a card player revealing her final hand. They were pictures, grainy but notorious in their power, of a young woman in a cafe with a man. The girl's face was turned away, but the earrings were mine. Unmistakable crescent studs I wore always, and the man's hand on hers looked like it belonged to a stranger. The timestamp suggested the photo was taken just last week. My father looked at me, and then at Imran, confusion blooming into D. He said he needed time. Then the aunties began their calls, voices oiled with empathy and sharpened with gossip. If you have ever tried to reason with a chorus, you know reason is not designed to be heard. That night, Samina came to my room and told me she was doing this for me, to save me from a life of instability, that Imran's family was not our match. Then she said the words that melted any hope of peace. She said, "If you marry him, do not expect to walk out of this house in white." I asked her if that was a threat, and she smiled like the cat again and said, "It's a fact." The next day, my father called a meeting. He said he needed to be sure. He wanted to postpone the wedding for a month to let the dust settle. A month was an eternity when your reputation is under a microscope and your love is under a blade. Imran held my hand. He asked my father to trust what he had seen of us, to trust his instincts about me. My father closed his eyes and chose fear. He said we would pause. And in that pause, Samina moved like a woman who had been waiting for this pause her whole life. She called vendors and relatives to say there had been a delay due to unforeseeable circumstances. She made the circumstances seem like storms and not like whispers. I learned something then about how one woman's influence can colonize an entire household. I would not let my life be a colony. I went to Imran's mother. I told her everything. She looked at me and sighed the sigh of someone who has weathered a few Samina-like women in her time. She said a good lie travels faster than a careful truth, but a careful truth has endurance. We planned our careful truth. We collected messages, statements, screenshots that actually mattered, documents that lined up like soldiers. We met the professor at his office, and he wrote a letter with the exact time and context of our cafe meeting, noting 3 students in attendance who also signed their names. We got the accountant to itemize, to cross-reference, to stamp. We built a binder that was heavier than rumor. We took it to my father. He looked through slowly. I watched the muscles in his jaw clench with each page, the guilt settling in layers like dust he had failed to wipe. Samina stood behind him, hands on his shoulders, like she owned them. When he finished, he looked up and I saw the father who used to braid my hair, shame flushed and apology blooming. He said he believed us. He said he had made a mistake listening to the wrong music. I cried, not out of relief, but out of the exhaustion of having to prove the obvious. Samina did not cry. She smiled and said she was glad the misunderstanding had been resolved, and then she made her final move. She said the wedding could proceed, but in her home there had to be standards, and given the gossip, it was better if we kept the ceremony extremely private, perhaps even canceled the reception. She suggested we conduct the nikah quietly at home, with only immediate family. She said a parade would only invite more scrutiny. I told her my wedding was not a funeral. She said dignity is not a parade. And that is when I realized what she wanted more than anything: control, displayed as morality. She did not want my happiness to be visible in the world. She did not want me to walk in white past neighbors who would say, "Look how she rose." She wanted me to pass unnoticed, like I had as a teenager, small and careful. I wanted to resist. My father wanted peace. Imran wanted me. We agreed to a compromise we thought we could live with: a smaller reception, a larger dinner at a later date. A nikah at home because my father had always dreamed of giving his daughter away under his own roof. I told myself the size of a celebration does not measure the size of a love. And then came the morning of my wedding. My dress hung on my closet door, light shimmering like a held breath. My cousins texted heart emojis. Imran sent a voice note, 3 sentences that felt like a blessing. The house smelled of cardamom and starch. I pinned the jasmine above my ear and thought of my mother. I heard the front door open, voices murmuring. The imam arrived, respectful, gentle. Imran and his family would join shortly. I stepped into the hallway and found my father tense and formal in his kurta. Samina elegant in a sari that glittered like hard frost. She held a folder. I have grown to dread her folders. She cleared her throat and said, "I assume we are all adult enough to do the right thing now that we have come to the final hour." She held up a sheet of paper. It looked like a contract. She said it was a small agreement she had drafted. It stated that after marriage, Imran and I would live in my father's house for at least a year, so that she could guide me as I adjusted to married life. That major financial decisions would be run by my father for the same period. That there would be no public reception to avoid unseemly chatter, and that any disagreements would be mediated by elders, specifically by her. I laughed. I couldn't help it. It bubbled out of me like the only possible response to absurdity. My father looked crushed. He asked Samina why she would spring this now, and she said that a bride is often overwhelmed and easily swayed by her husband, and she wanted to ensure my choices were still safe. Imran arrived in the middle of this. He took one look at my face and stepped to my side. My father tried to explain, stumbling over his own disappointment and a desire for order. Imran asked for the paper. He read it respectfully, then folded it in half, then in half again, and placed it on the console table. He said, "Aisha and I will make our own agreements. We have already shown we are capable." Samina's face did a delicate thing then. One corner lifted, as if to contain a triumph. She lowered her voice and said, "If you don't sign, then you will not have your wedding in this house." Imran said, "That is fine. We can go to the mosque as planned if that makes everybody more comfortable." And he turned to me, and I said, "Yes." And then my father, who had promised me jasmine and sunshine, said we needed to calm down, that it was too late to change venues, that people were arriving, that the imam was in our living room, that a scene would be humiliating. He took a breath and said, "Aisha, for me, just sign." I looked at him. I looked at the door, at the sunlight on the floor. I looked at my hands. I knew that if I signed, I would be a wife in a house where my voice was a guest. I knew that if I refused, I would be a daughter who disappointed the man who had braided my hair. I turned to Imran and I saw in his eyes a trust that said, "Choose yourself." "I will come," I said no. The word was a steady stone. "No." Samina's eyes gleamed. She said, "Then you are not walking to your wedding today?" She lifted her chin at my father. He did not meet my eyes. He said, "We must maintain order." He said, "We can reschedule once we have worked out the details." He said, "Aisha, go to your room. This is not the way." The imam coughed in the living room. The neighbors' cars hummed outside. The jasmine above my ear suddenly smelled sharp, like a memory that hurt. I turned to Imran. I said, "Let's go." My father blocked the door and said, "Aisha, don't do this." Imran said softly, "Uncle, please." My father raised his voice for the first time in years and said, "If you walk out today, do not come back." Silence sat between us like a judge. I looked at the woman who had turned my house into a courtroom. I looked at the man who had taught me to be gentle. Then I picked up the part of myself I had kept in the cupboard all these years, the brown paper dream, and I held it like a torch. I said, "Then I will not come back." I walked past them, Imran at my shoulder, his mother behind him murmuring a prayer, the imam stepping aside with a sad smile. At the gate, I turned and said to my father, "Your daughter is getting married today. You are welcome to join us where love is not on a leash." He did not follow. We went to the mosque. We called the few people who mattered most, and they came. The nikah was simple and pure, and without any of the soft luxuries I had imagined, but when I said yes, it felt like a key turning in a lock that had been stiff with disuse. We signed our own paper. We blessed our own beginning. I did not cry, not yet. After the ceremony, Imran and I returned to his mother's house, where every wall smelled like cardamom and sun. We ate sweet rice and laughed until it all collapsed into relief. We did not have music or speeches, but we had each other. That evening, my father sent a single message. "Come tomorrow, we will talk." It was the first thread I had from the life before. I replied, "I will come when you are ready to treat me as a woman, not a possession." The next morning, a different message arrived, not from my father, but from a number I recognized anyway. My stepmother. She wrote 3 lines. The first said, "I am sorry things escalated." The second said, "If you are ready to apologize and sign, we can still announce a formal reception later." The third said, "If not, we will need to inform people that you chose to leave in a disrespectful manner so they understand why we cannot host you." It was a threat disguised as a proclamation. I stared at it and realized how revenge sometimes arrives, not as a storm, but as a decision to stop hiding from sunlight. I do not like the word revenge. It sounds like fire and chaos and wasted rooms. But sometimes revenge is the last defense of dignity. Sometimes it is a blueprint. I told Imran everything I knew about this woman, how she cultivated her image like a garden and sprayed weed killer on anything that threatened it. He listened and then said, "We can be strategic. We do not have to scream." The plan began with truth, because truth was the one weapon Samina never expected me to wield publicly. She expected me to be the quiet daughter, the one who would be shamed into silence by the threat of whispers. I built a record. I wrote down dates, times, messages, the little manipulations that had become the wallpaper of my life. I spoke to cousins who had witnessed the contract demand. I asked the imam if he would be willing to acknowledge the scene. He said he could say there was pressure applied, that he had felt uncomfortable. I requested from professors the letter we had obtained earlier and asked permission to share it if it became necessary. I met with my father's oldest friend, Uncle Tariq, a man who had known me since I was small, who had watched Samina's gentle cruelty grow like ivy over our house. He told me something that strengthened my spine. He said, "Aisha, your father is a good man who has been corralled by a careful predator." He said, "Help him see. Help the others see." So I made a decision. I would host a reception. I would host it in a place that had no memory of being policed, a community hall by the river. I would invite people who had been waiting to see whether I would shrink or stand. I would not wait for Samina to give me permission to honor my marriage. This was not about spectacle, it was about narrative. I designed the invitations myself. I chose simple cream cards with a line of jasmine vines at the top. I wrote with joy, Aisha and Imran invite you to celebrate their marriage, and I included the truth in a single dignified sentence on an enclosed note. Due to unforeseen pressure and demands that conflicted with our values, we chose a small nikah at the mosque. We would be honored to celebrate with you now. We printed 100. We delivered them by hand and with a smile that did not apologize. When people asked, I answered calmly and consistently. I did not mention the contract until asked. When asked, I described it without rancor, just details. Rumor hates details. Details make rumor shrivel. Samina responded by calling me ungrateful, saying to anyone who would listen that I had abandoned tradition and family, that I was rude to elders. She said girls these days. She said poor Abid. She said I tried to help. I did not respond directly to any of it. I watched the invitations ripple through our community like a clean wind. We set a date 2 weeks away. I arranged a modest caterer, a friend of Imran's mother who made food that tasted like memory. I hired a photographer who did not care for glamour, only for tenderness. I chose a new dress, a simple, elegant piece with a narrow belt and sleeves that made me feel like a poem walking. I paid for it with the money I had saved behind the flower tin all those years, and there was something deeply right about that. As the date approached, I wondered if my father would come. I hoped he would choose his daughter over his fear. I sent him a personal message, not to beg, but to invite. Baba, I have always wanted you to be the man by my side when I celebrate big things. I understand you are hurting. You do not need to choose sides. You only need to choose love. He did not reply. 2 days before the reception, Samina sent one final message, a last arrow. She said that if I continued with this disgrace, she would share the cafe photo more widely and add that I had been seen behaving inappropriately before marriage, to explain why my father had to call off the home ceremony. She said she would protect the family name even if it meant ruining mine. I stared at her words and felt something ancient in me rise, something that had been patient too long. I typed back a single sentence. If you defame me, I will show the contract you tried to force on me the morning of my wedding, along with witness statements and the imam's account, and I will file a defamation claim. I will also make sure every woman in our community sees the exact method by which you try to control their lives. 10 minutes later, she replied with a dot, then another dot, then nothing. On the day of our reception, the river looked like silk under the late afternoon sun. People came in pairs and groups, some curious, some supportive, some carrying the cautious expressions of those who've heard 2 versions of a story and are ready to decide which one to keep. Imran squeezed my hand and whispered, "This is our sweet day." I laughed and cried at the same time. His mother kissed my forehead and told me I looked like a good decision. We stood at the entrance and welcomed everyone like we were welcoming ourselves into the world. The food glowed on the tables. The photographer moved among us like a gentle wind, catching laughter, catching old friendships, reweaving themselves. I gave a short speech because I believe in mirroring pressure with clarity. I thanked our families. I thanked our friends. I thanked the patience that had kept us steady. I said, some of you know that we faced a few storms on our way here. I said, I will not address whispers with whispers. I will only tell you that when a woman is asked to sign away her voice, she should not sign. I did not name Samina. I did not speak my father's failure in public, but I let the weight of my words fall where they were meant to fall. People nodded. Some clapped softly, like they were congratulating more than a marriage. Near the end of the evening, as we were preparing to cut a tiny cake a cousin had made for us, I saw my father walking up the path beside the river, alone. He looked smaller and older, and yet somehow like the father who used to braid my hair. He stopped a few feet from me, and the crowd shifted to give us space. He said my name, just once, and in that sound there was apology and pride and regret. He took my hands and said, I am sorry. I failed you. I let fear sit in my chair and speak for me. I pulled him into an embrace that tasted like salt and jasmine and forgiveness still being negotiated. Samina did not come. She sent a message later. I hope you enjoyed your little show. I did not reply. Revenge is not always a spectacle. Sometimes it is a ledger quietly balancing. But I was not done. I had decided that I would not only reclaim my wedding, I would make sure that the woman who tried to choke it would learn that control has consequences. So, I gathered my documentation and requested a meeting with the community committee that oversees disputes and represents families in local decisions, fundraising, school board selections, the types of committees where Samina held a soft, unchallenged power. I presented my statement to them, not to shame her for sport, but to draw a line around acceptable behavior. I said, "This is what happened. Here are the witnesses. Here is the imam's statement about the morning of the ceremony. Here is the contract she attempted to force on me." I explained that Samina had threatened to defame me publicly if I did not comply. I said I would be filing a formal complaint if she continued, and that I was here first to let my community see the shape of this harm so it could not hide under the veil of tradition. The room was quiet. The committee glanced at the papers and at each other. One of the women, a teacher who had once taught me to read poems in a voice loud enough to be heard at the back of the class, looked almost fierce with something that approached joy. She said, "We should have drawn this line a long time ago." And then a small wave began, the kind you only notice because it reaches your ankles. Women started telling their own smaller stories, of contracts pushed, of permissions demanded, of weddings managed like military drills. I sat and listened, and I understood that my revenge could be bigger and cleaner than just turning a rumor back on its owner. My revenge could be policy. Within a month, the committee announced new guidelines for family-hosted ceremonies and disputes. They declared that any pre-ceremony agreements had to be discussed at least 1 week before the event and could not be presented the day of. They established a process for mediation that did not allow a single person, especially a step-parent with a conflict of interest, to dominate. They added a clause stating that any attempt to coerce or defame a bride or groom would be investigated, and names would be publicly recorded in a file community members could access when considering leadership roles. They insisted that brides and grooms be given the right to choose a support person to advocate in any dispute. They asked the imam to create a short talk that would precede each nikah, reminding families that marriage is a covenant, not a spectacle, and certainly not a place to cement control. And they circulated a quiet letter to the families who managed committees and events, asking them to recommit to dignity over dominance. It was a revolution in polite paper. Samina called my father furious, accusing me of humiliating her, of ruining her reputation. My father, who had finally remembered how to be a father, told her that reputations are not ruined by truth. They are cleansed. He told her that she would be stepping down from her committee positions for a while to consider her behavior. She moved out of our house temporarily to stay with her sister, not out of shame, but out of anger. She sent me one last message. "You think you have won." I looked at Imran, at the jasmine-cutting sunlight on our little balcony, at the receipts from the caterer that we had paid together, at the new guidelines folded in my bag with everyone else's names kept private, and I thought, I do not need to win. I need to live without asking permission to breathe. Days turned into the quiet of newlywed normal. We worked, we cooked, we argued about silly things and apologized properly. I visited my father weekly, and we learned how to speak around and then through the thing that had happened. He started sending me pictures of sunrises again, like Imran used to when we were new, and I sent him pictures of the recipes I learned from Imran's mother. And I told my story quietly to women who needed it. But revenge, the last piece of it, the part that returned balance to my own story, came one afternoon when I received a forwarded email by accident. It was from a decorator to Samina, billing her for services related to a reception that had been planned to take place at our house, listing items like fabric walls, special chairs, and a last-minute podium rental, with dates that matched my wedding day. I scrolled through, confused. At the bottom was a note. As requested, we have drafted the alterations to the program and are ready to announce the change in bride entrance to occur from the side door after the contract signing ceremony in the foyer. A strange weight settled in my stomach. I met the decorator at a tea stall under the pretense of clarifying some details for a future event. He recognized me, embarrassed, and in his embarrassment, he confessed. Samina had planned to surprise me at my own wedding by moving certain parts around, by orchestrating a small ceremony in the foyer before the imam arrived, where I would sign the paper she had drafted under the pretense of document filing, watched by selected elders, so that by the time the nikah started, I would already have agreed to her terms. She had even prepared a short speech to guide the young couple and had hired a cousin to film it. She had booked 2 musicians to play over the imam's quiet recitation, so the short contract ceremony would feel integrated. She had planned an entrance for me from a side door, escorted by her, not my father. The audacity of it made my breath jump. A chill ran through me, not of fear, but of betrayal freshly painted. This was not just control, it was theater. She had written me into a play where I wasn't allowed to read the script until my lines had already ruined me. I thanked the decorator and paid him for tea, and left with a steady, sharpened calm. Sometimes revenge finds you, sometimes you must go find it, like a letter you forgot to send. I took this new evidence to the committee, not to reopen the case, but to complete it. They added to the record of her behavior. They called a private meeting with her and my father. She arrived with the same serenity she used to cook into her lentils, but this time the room did not bow to her. They asked her to explain. She said she had misunderstood. She said everyone was dramatizing. The decorator, summoned, shook in his chair and told the truth. My father listened with an ache that will always be a room inside him. The committee informed Samina she would be removed from her roles for a year, and that if she initiated any smear against me or any other woman, the file would be made public. They sent a note to the imam advising him to speak more boldly about coercion at the start of ceremonies. They also created a small fund to help couples who chose to host their receptions independently when family interference threatened them. This is what revenge looks like when it has grown up. Not a knife, but a policy. Not a scream, but a system that makes screaming unnecessary next time. I went home that night and placed a jasmine sprig and a glass of water on our kitchen table. Imran slid his arms around me and rested his chin on my shoulder.